an original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. Celeste Armitage stands in the center of Haverleigh's grand hall, her hands folded calmly at her waist, as 200 eyes turn toward her. The Duke of Haverleigh rises from his chair, his voice carrying across the marble floor, as he announces his intention to settle her debts. Debts she does not owe, rumors she did not start. The room holds its breath, waiting for her gratitude, her tears. Instead, she lifts her chin, and a smile touches her lips, not bitter, not angry, but certain. She speaks clearly, her words falling like stones into still water. Your Grace, I could buy your entire county. The silence that follows is absolute. The Duke's hand freezes mid-gesture. The candles flicker in their sconces. And in that moment, the careful architecture of assumption and power begins to crack. The grand hall of Haverleigh House had been built to inspire awe. Vaulted ceilings rose 30 feet above the polished marble floor, their arches carved with the crests of 5 generations. Tall windows lined the eastern wall, letting in the late afternoon light that fell in golden bars across the room. Chandeliers hung from iron chains, their crystals catching the sun and scattering it into fragments of color. It was a room designed to remind visitors of their place in the order of things. And on this particular afternoon, it was filled with the county's most prominent families, gathered for what had been announced as a charitable assembly. Duke Rowan Haverleigh stood near the center of the hall, his posture straight and his expression composed. He was 32 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair that he kept neatly trimmed and eyes the color of slate. He wore a dark coat of fine wool, tailored to perfection, and his cravat was tied with the kind of precision that suggested a man who valued order. He had inherited the dukedom 6 years earlier, when his father had succumbed to pneumonia, and he had spent those years rebuilding what had been neglected. He was not a man given to excess or cruelty. He believed in duty, in responsibility, in the proper stewardship of power, and he believed, without question, that his role was to protect those who depended on him. Among the assembled guests was Celeste Armitage. She stood near the back of the room, her presence unremarkable to most. She was a woman of perhaps 29 or 30, dressed in a simple gown of dark blue wool, her hair pinned in a modest style that drew no particular attention. She had been introduced to the household 3 weeks earlier as a temporary secretary, hired to assist with the estate's correspondence during the absence of the regular clerk. She moved through the house quietly, spoke when spoken to, and gave no one reason to notice her beyond the competence of her work. But Rowan had noticed her, not because of her appearance, which was pleasant but unremarkable, nor because of any particular charm. He had noticed her because of the way she carried herself. There was a stillness to her, a quality of self-possession that seemed unusual in someone of her station. She did not fidget. She did not seek approval. When she entered a room, she did so with quiet certainty, as though she had every right to be there. It was a small thing, but it had caught his attention. And then, 2 days earlier, he had received a letter. It had come from a banker in London, a man named Grimsby whom Rowan knew only by reputation. The letter had been brief and to the point. It informed the Duke that Miss Celeste Armitage, currently employed at Haverleigh House, was in considerable financial distress. She owed, according to Grimsby, a sum of nearly £3,000, debts incurred, the letter suggested, through poor investments and unfortunate family obligations. The letter did not ask for anything directly. It simply provided the information, as though Grimsby thought the Duke ought to know. Rowan had read the letter twice, frowning. £3,000 was not a trivial sum, but it was not insurmountable either. What troubled him was the idea that Miss Armitage had been working in his household, while burdened by such worry. He imagined her lying awake at night, calculating interest, fearing the knock of a creditor. It seemed unjust. And so, with the certainty of a man who had never questioned his ability to solve problems, he had decided to act. He had not consulted her. It had not occurred to him that consultation was necessary. He was offering help, after all. Rescue. What could be objectionable about that? And so, as the assembled guests sipped tea and exchanged pleasantries in the golden light of the hall, Rowan cleared his throat and raised his voice just enough to command attention. The room quieted. Faces turned toward him. He allowed a small, reassuring smile to touch his lips. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm and measured, "I hope you will indulge me for a moment. As many of you know, this gathering was convened to discuss charitable efforts within our county. But before we turn to those broader concerns, I wish to address a more immediate matter." He paused, letting the silence settle. His gaze moved across the room and came to rest on Celeste, who stood near the far wall. She did not move. Her expression remained neutral, though her eyes met his without flinching. "Miss Armitage," Rowan continued, "has been of great assistance to this household in recent weeks. Her work has been exemplary, and I have come to hold her in considerable regard. It has recently come to my attention, however, that she labors under a burden of debt, a burden that, through no fault of her own, threatens her security and peace of mind." A murmur rippled through the room. Heads turned. Celeste's name was whispered. She did not look away from Rowan, though her hands, which had been folded loosely at her waist, tightened slightly. "It is my intention," Rowan said, his voice firm and clear, "to settle those debts in full. I do this not out of pity, but out of respect for her service, and out of a belief that those who work honestly should not be made to suffer for circumstances beyond their control. I hope that this act will relieve her of worry and allow her to continue her work without the shadow of financial distress." He said it as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though kindness and authority were the same thing, as though offering to pay a woman's debts in front of 200 people was an act of generosity rather than presumption. The room erupted in polite applause. Several guests nodded approvingly. A woman near the front whispered to her companion, "How very noble of His Grace." And then, into that warm tide of approval, Celeste laughed. It was not a bitter laugh, nor a cruel one. It was clear and measured, almost musical. But it cut through the applause like a blade through silk. The clapping faltered and stopped. Faces turned toward her, confusion replacing approval. Rowan's smile froze. His hand, which had been raised in a gesture of benevolent conclusion, lowered slowly to his side. Celeste took a single step forward. Her expression was calm, almost gentle. But there was something in her eyes, something bright and unyielding, that made the room hold its breath. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I appreciate the kindness of your intention. Truly I do. But I must respectfully decline." Rowan blinked. "Decline? Yes." She paused, and the faintest smile touched her lips. "You see, the debts you speak of do not exist. Or rather, they exist only in the imagination of certain individuals who have sought to create a fiction for their own purposes. I owe nothing to anyone." The murmur that followed was louder now, edged with confusion and curiosity. Rowan's brow furrowed. "Miss Armitage, I assure you, the information I received was quite specific. I do not doubt that you received information, Your Grace." Celeste interrupted gently. "But information is not the same as truth. And the truth is this. I could, if I wished, purchase your entire county." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as though the air itself had been drawn from the room. Rowan stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile her words with everything he thought he knew. Around him, faces registered shock, disbelief, and in some cases, poorly concealed delight at the spectacle. Celeste did not elaborate. She simply stood there, her hands folded once more, her expression serene. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted. The marble floor, the vaulted ceiling, the golden light, all of it remained the same. But the balance of power in that room had tilted quietly and irrevocably toward the woman in the dark blue gown. Celeste Armitage had not always been invisible. There had been a time in her childhood when she had been seen. Her father, Thomas Armitage, had been a merchant of moderate success, dealing in textiles and tobacco, imported from the colonies. He had been a man of sharp mind and sharper tongue, who believed that wealth was not merely a comfort, but a weapon. He had taught his daughter to read ledgers before she could read poetry, to calculate interest before she understood affection. He had not done this out of love, precisely, but out of a pragmatic recognition that she was clever, and that cleverness, properly directed, could be useful. When Celeste was 16, her father had arranged a marriage for her. The prospective groom was a man twice her age, a minor landowner with debts he hoped to erase through her dowry. Celeste had sat quietly through the negotiations, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. And then, the night before the contract was to be signed, she had gone to her father's study and laid out, in meticulous detail, why the marriage would ruin them both. She had shown him the man's debts, his creditors, the likelihood of foreclosure. She had presented an alternative investment that would yield 3 times the return within 2 years. Her father had stared at her for a long moment. Then he had torn up the marriage contract and never mentioned it again. 2 years later, Thomas Armitage died suddenly of a stroke. He left behind a modest estate and a trust carefully constructed to ensure that his daughter would not be left destitute. But what he had not anticipated was that Celeste would take that trust, over the course of a decade, transform it into something far greater. She had studied the markets, identified opportunities, and invested with a precision that would have impressed even her father. She had purchased shares in shipping ventures, acquired notes on failing estates, and quietly accumulated influence across 3 counties. But she had learned something else in those years, that visible wealth made women vulnerable. Men who learned of her resources did not see her as capable. They saw her as a prize to be won, a fortune to be managed, a problem to be solved through marriage. And so she had learned to disappear. She had taken positions as a clerk, a secretary, a copyist. She had moved through the world quietly, allowing others to see only what they expected. A woman of modest means, unremarkable and unthreatening. The debts that Grimsby had reported to the Duke were a fiction. They had been invented by her cousin, a man named Philip Armitage, who had spent his inheritance on gambling and poor investments, and now sought to force Celeste into a marriage that would give him access to her trust. He had enlisted Grimsby, a banker of flexible ethics, to spread the rumor of her financial distress. The plan was simple: create a crisis, offer a solution in the form of marriage to Philip, and absorb her wealth into his control. But Celeste had seen it coming. She always did. And she had come to Haverleigh, not because she needed employment, but because Philip's scheme threatened more than her own security. Grimsby held notes on several tenant farms within the Haverleigh estate. If the scheme succeeded, those families would be dispossessed, their homes seized to cover debts that existed only on paper. Celeste had taken the position as secretary to gain access to the estate's records, to understand the scope of the threat, and to find a way to stop it. She had not anticipated that the Duke himself would become involved, and she certainly had not anticipated that he would attempt to rescue her in front of half the county. Rowan Haverleigh had inherited his title at a time when inheritance felt less like a gift and more like a sentence. His father, the previous Duke, had been a man of tradition and little vision. He had managed the estate as his father had, and his father before him, with a kind of benign neglect that allowed things to function without ever improving. Tenancies were renewed on outdated terms. Repairs were deferred. Innovations were dismissed as unnecessary. And when the old Duke died, Rowan had found himself the steward of a crumbling legacy. He had spent the first 2 years simply trying to understand the scope of the problem. He had ridden out to every tenant farm, met with every family, inspected every structure. He had sat in his study late into the night, poring over account books that had not been properly reconciled in a decade, and slowly, carefully, he had begun to rebuild. He had renegotiated tenancies to make them fair without being ruinous. He had invested in drainage systems, in better tools, in repairs that his father had ignored. He had modernized where he could, without abandoning the traditions that gave people a sense of continuity. It had been exhausting work, but it had also been deeply satisfying. Rowan believed, with a conviction that ran bone deep, that power was responsibility, that to hold authority was to serve those who depended on you. He did not see himself as superior to his tenants. He saw himself as their steward, their protector, and he took that role seriously. But he had never questioned the premise beneath it all, that his role was to decide, to govern, to provide. He had never imagined that help could be harm, that protection could be possession. He had believed, without ever articulating it, that those who needed assistance were grateful for it, that offering aid was an unambiguous good. And so when he had learned of Celeste's supposed debts, he had seen only a problem to be solved, a woman to be spared humiliation. He had not asked her if she wanted his help. He had not considered that she might not need it. He had simply assumed that his resources and his authority entitled him to act. Her laughter in the hall had shattered that assumption. It had not been defiant in the way he understood defiance, angry or desperate. It had been something else entirely. It had been the laughter of someone who knew something he did not. Someone who was not impressed by his title, or his wealth, or his certainty. And for the first time in years, Rowan felt the ground beneath his convictions begin to crack. The days following the confrontation in the hall were strange and uncomfortable. The guests had departed in a flurry of whispered speculation, and the household had settled back into its routines. But nothing felt quite the same. Rowan found himself distracted during meetings with his steward, his thoughts drifting back to the image of Celeste standing in the golden light, her voice calm and certain as she dismantled his assumptions in front of 200 witnesses. He did not know what to do with the feeling. It was not anger, precisely, though there was a thread of indignation woven through it. It was something closer to confusion, edged with a discomfort he could not name. He had been wrong, not in his intentions perhaps, but in his actions, and he did not know how to reconcile that. On the third day, he summoned her to his study. He told himself it was to clarify the estate's accounts, to ensure there were no irregularities. But the truth, which he did not quite admit even to himself, was that he needed to understand. He needed to know who she was, and why she had looked at him the way she had. She arrived precisely at the appointed hour. She knocked twice, waited for his acknowledgement, and entered with the same quiet composure she always carried. She wore a different gown today, a deep gray that made her eyes seem darker. She carried a leather folder under one arm. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head slightly. "You wish to see me?" "Yes." Rowan gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit." She sat, folding her hands in her lap. Her expression was polite, but unreadable. Rowan cleared his throat. "Miss Armitage, I believe we need to have a conversation." Of course, he hesitated, unsure how to begin. Finally, he said, "I must confess, I am at a loss. Your statement in the hall about purchasing the county, was it meant as hyperbole, or it was not hyperbole?" Celeste said calmly. She opened the folder and withdrew a sheaf of documents. She laid them on the desk between them with careful precision. "These are trust instruments, contracts, and financial records. If you examine them, you will see that I control a trust established by my father and expanded through my own investments over the past 10 years. That trust holds notes on several estates within this county and the 2 adjoining, including Haverleigh." Rowan stared at the documents. He did not reach for them immediately. "Notes on Haverleigh?" "Yes. Your estate borrowed against future revenues 3 years ago to fund drainage improvements. The note was sold twice before it came into my possession. I hold it now." His jaw tightened. "You hold my debt." "I hold a note secured by a portion of your estate's income," Celeste corrected gently. "It is not the same as holding your debt personally. But yes, in practical terms, I have a financial interest in Haverleigh's stability." Rowan sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had known about the loan, of course. It had been necessary, and the terms had been reasonable. But he had never thought to trace where the note had ended up. It had seemed irrelevant. Now suddenly, it was the most relevant thing in the world. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, his voice low. "Because it was not relevant to my work here," Celeste said. "And because I have learned that men who know of my resources tend to see me differently. They stop seeing me as a person and start seeing me as a problem to be managed, or an opportunity to be seized." Rowan winced. The truth of her words was uncomfortably sharp, and the debts that Grimsby reported. A fabrication. Celeste's voice remained steady, but there was a flicker of something harder in her eyes. "My cousin, Philip Armitage, is a man of ambition and poor judgment. He spent his inheritance unwisely, and now seeks to force me into marriage, so that he can access my trust. He enlisted Grimsby to spread the rumor of my financial distress, hoping to create a crisis that would make me desperate enough to accept his proposal. That is unconscionable." "Yes," Celeste agreed. "It is, but it is also effective if left unchallenged, and that is why I came to Haverleigh." Grimsby holds notes on several of your tenant farms. If Philip's scheme succeeds, those families will lose their homes. I came to prevent that." Rowan stared at her. The pieces were falling into place now, and the picture they formed was deeply unsettling. She had not come to Haverleigh seeking employment or refuge. She had come to protect people she did not even know, using her own resources and risking her own exposure. And he, in his arrogance, had assumed she needed saving. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Celeste tilted her head slightly. "For what precisely?" "For presuming to know your circumstances. For offering help you did not need. For," he hesitated, then forced himself to continue, "for treating you as though you were helpless." She regarded him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. "Your Grace, I do not fault you for wanting to help. Kindness is not a flaw. But kindness without consent is still a form of control. And I will not be controlled. Not by my cousin, not by Grimsby, and not by you." The words were gentle, but they landed with the force of a blow. Rowan nodded slowly. "I understand." "Do you?" Celeste asked. There was no challenge in her tone, only curiosity. "I am beginning to," Rowan said. And he meant it. They began to work together after that, not as Duke and subordinate, but as two individuals attempting to untangle a crisis that threatened more than pride. Celeste spread the documents across the broad oak table in Rowan's study, and together they traced the web of false debts and real consequences. Grimsby had been careful, but not careful enough. There were inconsistencies in the dates, discrepancies in the amounts, and a pattern of coercion that became clear once they knew to look for it. But the work was not easy. Rowan, accustomed to command, struggled to accept that his judgments were not final. More than once, he proposed a course of action, writing to the magistrate, confronting Grimsby directly, only to have Celeste quietly, firmly, redirect him. She did not argue. She simply presented facts, alternatives, consequences, and each time he had to choose, to insist on his authority, or to trust her knowledge. He began, slowly, to choose trust. But Celeste maintained a careful distance. She did not soften toward him. She did not invite familiarity. When their work was done for the day, she gathered her papers, thanked him politely, and left. She did not linger. She did not meet his eyes longer than necessary. And Rowan, who had never particularly cared whether his employees liked him, found that her distance troubled him in ways he could not quite name. One evening, as the light faded and the candles were lit, he set down his pen and said, "Miss Armitage, may I ask you something?" She looked up from the ledger she was reviewing. "Of course. Why do you keep me at arm's length?" The question surprised her. He could see it in the brief widening of her eyes, the slight pause before she answered. "I do not mean to be rude, Your Grace." "I do not think you are rude," Rowan said. "But I sense that you do not trust me, and I wonder why." Celeste closed the ledger carefully. She folded her hands on top of it and met his gaze. "It is not that I do not trust you, precisely. It is that I have learned to be cautious. Men who respect women in crisis often seek to possess them in peace. You have been honorable in your dealings with me, and I am grateful for that. But I will not trade one form of captivity for another, no matter how golden the cage." Her words were calm, but they carried a weight that settled heavily in the room. Rowan felt something tighten in his chest, shame, perhaps, or recognition. "I see. I hope you do," Celeste said softly, "because I believe you are a good man, Your Grace. But good men can still do harm when they believe their intentions justify their actions." Rowan nodded slowly. He did not trust himself to speak. And after a moment, Celeste gathered her papers and left, closing the door quietly behind her. The turning point came not in a grand confrontation, but in a small stone cottage on the edge of the estate. Rowan and Celeste rode out together on a cold morning, their breath misting in the air, to meet with a tenant family whose name had appeared in Grimsby's records. The widow, Mary Ashford, lived there with her 3 children. Her late husband had worked the land for 2 generations, and the cottage had been in the family for longer than anyone could remember. When they arrived, Mary was standing in the doorway, a letter clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. The children, 2 boys and a girl, none older than 10, watched from behind her skirts with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Your Grace, Mary said, her voice trembling. I did not expect, I am honored, Mrs. Ashford, Rowan said gently, dismounting. Please, do not trouble yourself. We are here to help. Mary's face crumpled. She held out the letter with a shaking hand. They say we must leave, that the land is to be seized. But I do not understand. My husband paid the rent. We have always paid. Rowan took the letter and read it quickly. It was from Grimsby's office, stamped with official seals, and it informed Mary that the cottage and fields were to be seized within the month to cover debts owed by the estate. It was a lie, of course, but it was a convincing lie, wrapped in the language of law and authority. Celeste dismounted and approached Mary. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she knelt beside the woman, bringing herself to eye level, and said quietly, Mrs. Ashford, I promise you, this seizure will not stand. It is based on falsehoods, and we will prove it. You will not lose your home. Mary stared at her, tears spilling down her cheeks. But how can you be sure? Because I know the law, Celeste said, and I know the men who are trying to deceive you, and I will not allow it. Rowan watched her, and something shifted in him. He had spent years believing that care was expressed through control, that protection required dominance. But Celeste did not control this woman. She did not speak for her, or decide for her. She listened. She asked what was needed. She offered power without taking it. And Rowan realized, with uncomfortable clarity, that he had never done the same. Word of Celeste's presence at Haverleigh, and of the Duke's unusual reliance on her counsel, began to circulate through the county's social circles. At a formal afternoon tea, hosted by Lady Pemberton, a woman of considerable standing and even more considerable opinions, the whispers grew bold enough to take shape. I do not mean to speak ill, Lady Pemberton said, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the women seated nearby. But one does wonder about the propriety of it all. A woman of uncertain background, working so closely with His Grace. It seems rather convenient, does it not? Another woman, younger and less careful, leaned in. Do you suppose she has designs on him? I could not say, Lady Pemberton replied, though her tone suggested she could say a great deal. But I do think someone ought to warn dear Rowan. He is such a kind man, and kindness can be exploited. Rowan, who had been standing near the window, with a cup of tea he had no intention of drinking, set the cup down with quiet precision. He crossed the room and stopped before Lady Pemberton's chair. The conversation around them faltered and died. Lady Pemberton, he said, his voice calm but edged with steel, I could not help but overhear your concern for my welfare. I appreciate it. But I must tell you that Miss Armitage's integrity and intelligence have proven invaluable to the stability of this estate. She has acted with honor and competence in every matter, and I will not have her character questioned in my presence. Lady Pemberton's face flushed. Your Grace, I meant no offense. I am sure you did not, Rowan said. But offense was given nonetheless, and I think it best that I take my leave. Thank you for your hospitality. He bowed, turned, and left the room. The silence he left behind was profound. Despite Rowan's defense, or perhaps because of it, Celeste began to withdraw. She continued her work, but she no longer met his eyes across the table. She no longer lingered in conversation. When he sought her thoughts, she offered them with professional brevity, and excused herself. Rowan did not understand at first. He believed he had acted honorably. He had defended her. He had trusted her. But Celeste knew what he did not yet see, that his defense, however well meant, had still positioned her as someone under his protection. She did not want to be his project, his cause, his woman to shelter. She wanted to be seen as she was, powerful, capable, and whole. And so she created distance, not out of coldness, but out of self-preservation. Rowan felt the loss keenly. The study seemed colder without her presence. Decisions felt less certain. He found himself listening for her footsteps in the corridor, waiting for the knock that did not come. And he realized, too late, that he had come to rely not only on her mind, but on the quiet strength of her company. One evening, he stood alone in the study, staring at the papers spread across the table, and admitted to himself what he had been avoiding. He did not know how to bridge the gap without once again imposing his will, and the not knowing was unbearable. The crisis reached its apex when Grimsby, sensing resistance, accelerated his plans. Legal notices were served. Foreclosure proceedings began. Tenant families across the estate received letters informing them that their homes and fields were to be seized within the month. Rowan met with his solicitors, with the local magistrate, with anyone who might halt the machinery of dispossession. But the law, as written, was not on his side. The documents were in order. The debts, though false, were recorded. Celeste, working quietly behind the scenes, gathered her own evidence. She compiled correspondence that revealed Philip's conspiracy, affidavits from those who had witnessed the fabrications, and most critically, the trust documents that proved her authority over the very notes being called. She did not present them to Rowan first. She took them directly to the magistrate, to the solicitor, to Grimsby himself. In a closed meeting, witnessed by a handful of officials, she dismantled the deception with calm, irrefutable precision. She laid out the timeline, the inconsistencies, the pattern of coercion. She presented the trust documents that showed her control over the notes Grimsby claimed to hold, and she made it clear, in language that left no room for misunderstanding, that any attempt to proceed with the foreclosures would result in legal action that would destroy Grimsby's reputation and Philip's prospects. Grimsby's face drained of color. Philip, when summoned, could not meet her gaze. The foreclosures were halted. The false debts were struck from the record, and Celeste's control over the trust, and by extension, over much of the county's financial stability, was made a matter of public record. Rowan learned of it, not from her, but from his solicitor, who arrived at Haverleigh with documents requiring the Duke's acknowledgement and cooperation. Rowan read them in silence, his jaw tight, and he understood fully what she had done. She had not needed him. She never had. Rowan did not sleep that night. He walked the estate's grounds as the stars wheeled overhead, his breath misting in the cold air. He replayed every moment, every assumption, every word. And by the time dawn began to pale the eastern sky, he knew what he must do. He found Celeste in the chapel, a small stone structure on the estate's northern edge, seldom used except for private reflection. She was seated in one of the wooden pews, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the light, filtering through the narrow windows. He entered quietly, and she did not turn. He sat beside her, leaving space between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was simply there, vast and patient. Then, in a voice low and steady, Rowan said, "I was wrong." Celeste turned her head slightly, just enough to see him. She did not speak. "Not wrong to offer help," he continued, "but wrong to assume it was mine to give. Wrong to believe that my resources entitled me to direct your path. Wrong to see you as someone to be saved, rather than someone to be trusted." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I have spent my life believing that power was responsibility, that to hold authority was to serve, and I still believe that. But I did not understand that service without consent is not service at all. It is control. And I have controlled you, Miss Armitage, even when I thought I was helping you. And for that I am deeply sorry." Celeste's expression softened, just slightly. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to hear it," Rowan said. "And because I want you to know what I have done. I have met with Grimsby, with the magistrate, with my own financial advisors. I have formally ended the estate's alliance with the banking house that enabled the deception. It will cost me politically, socially, perhaps financially. But it is the right thing to do, not because it saves you, because it aligns my actions with my conscience." He turned to face her fully. "I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am not asking for anything. I simply wanted you to know that I see you, not as a problem to solve, not as a woman to protect, as someone I would be honored to stand beside, if you will allow it." Celeste looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were clear calm. "Why?" she asked quietly. Rowan met her gaze. "Because power without consent is tyranny, even when it wears the mask of kindness." It was the answer she needed. Not a declaration of love, not a plea, just truth. They returned to Haverleigh House together, as the morning sun spilled across the fields, turning the frost to diamonds. The estate was waking, servants moving through corridors, fires being lit, the daily rhythm resuming. But the grand hall, where it all began, was empty. Rowan led Celeste there, though neither had spoken of why. The light fell just as it did on that first day, golden and clear, illuminating the marble floors, and the high windows. He stopped in the center of the hall. From his finger, he removed the signet ring that marked his authority, the seal of his family, the symbol of his power. He placed it on the table between them, not as a renunciation, as an offering. "I will not govern you," he said quietly. "I will not decide for you. If you choose to stay, it will be as my equal. If you choose to leave, I will not stand in your way. But I want you to know," his voice wavered, just slightly, "I want you to know that I see you, not as someone to protect, as someone I would be honored to stand beside." Celeste looked at the ring, at him. The silence stretched, delicate and vast. Then, with slow deliberation, she picked up the ring. She turned it in her fingers, feeling the weight of it, the history. And instead of pocketing it, instead of returning it with words of rejection or acceptance, she stepped forward and placed it back on his hand. Her fingers lingered for just a moment against his. "I am not yours to claim, Your Grace," she said softly, "but I am here by choice, and that is worth more than any title or fortune." He closed his hand around hers, just briefly. It was not a vow. It was not a promise of forever. It was simply the acknowledgement of two people who had found in each other something rare. True respect, true partnership, true equality. The days that followed were not marked by grand celebrations or public declarations. Celeste remained at Haverleigh, but her role shifted. She was no longer the invisible secretary. She was acknowledged, consulted, respected. The tenant families whose homes were saved spoke of her with quiet reverence. Philip and Grimsby faded into obscurity, their reputations ruined by their own greed. Rowan learned, slowly and sometimes clumsily, to share power rather than wield it. He asked before deciding. He listened before acting. And Celeste, for her part, allowed herself to be seen, not as a woman hiding her strength, but as one who wore it openly, without apology. They worked together on the estate's matters, but they also walked together in the evenings, when the light softened and the world grew quiet. They spoke of small things and large ones, of history and hope, of wounds and healing. There was affection between them, yes, but it was built on something deeper than attraction. It was built on respect earned, trust given, and choices made freely. One evening, as autumn began to cool the air, they stood together in the grand hall once more. The candles had burned low. The house was silent. Rowan turned to her, and without words, offered his hand. Celeste took it, not because she needed his support, because she chose his company. They walked together toward the door, and as they passed through it, the last candle guttered and went dark. The hall was left in stillness, but it was not empty. It was full of all that had passed within it. Pride humbled, power shared, love chosen with open eyes. And when morning came, the light would find them still together, not because fate demanded it, but because they decided it. That, in the end, is the only kind of love that lasts.